A lot of them are derivative from the knowledge that was said to be possessed by Solomon and his ability to command the jinn. They're full of instructions for making magical circles, magical tools, performing various rituals at certain astrologically auspicious times to summon up different kinds of entities to perform tasks. And most of these tasks would be related in earlier centuries, what people wanted. They wanted to divine the future, they wanted to look for treasure, they wanted to procure love, they wanted to manipulate other people. So these were the common tasks. And these texts are still around today, and many of them have been kind of revised and updated and rewritten for modern practitioners. Well, the Testament of Solomon also tells the story of the Queen of Sheba, who was a beautiful and very powerful ruler during the day of Solomon. Now, Solomon, according to the Bible, had hundreds of wives and concubines, so why he thought he needed another one, who knows how many is too many. But he became fascinated by the Queen of Sheba and wanted to summon her to his court. Now, I like this representation, this modern representation of this enigma of a woman, because she's shown here in a very powerful aspect. She obviously commands the forces of nature by being able to have docile lions at her side, and she is holding a mask, and that is a symbol of the jinn, because they are the hidden ones. They are constantly masked. Well, the king's advisors were very upset that Solomon was fascinated by this woman, because it was well known throughout the land that she was half jinn. Now, we have stories today of human beings having unions with other kinds of entities, with ETs, with angels, with a lot of things out there, and producing offspring. These stories have existed since ancient times. And this was no different for the jinn, that human beings and jinn could mate together and produce offspring who would look like people but have the powers of the jinn. They were considered to be very, very dangerous. So King Solomon was going to be fascinated by a half-jinn ruler of the land. His advisors feared that she was going to have power over him. So they devised a test to determine whether or not she was actually half-jinn. They didn't really know for sure. Is there any way to get the lights down a little bit so we can see some of these a little better? Or is that as low as they're going to get? They can? Okay. Yeah, if we'd have them down just a bit, please. If someone was half jinn, there would be a part of their anatomy that would give them away, and it would be their feet. Their feet would be goat-like or donkey-like. They would be hairy, not cloven hoof, but hairy, like an animal's leg. So the advisors spread the temple with a sheet of water, a very thin sheet of water that would cause the Queen of Sheba to lift her skirts up when she paid a visit to King Solomon, and then they could see the condition of her lower legs and feet. Well, here she is at the court of King Solomon, marching up the stairs to meet him, and we've got too much light in the room now, but her feet are bare, and they look like human feet. So she evidently passed the test, but nonetheless, his advisors were still certain that somehow she was tricking the king, and they always kept an eye on her to make sure that she never gained too much power. The jinn were absorbed into Islam, and there's an entire chapter about them in the Quran called Al-Jinn, the jinn. There are numerous other references to them in the Quran, and many references to them in the Quranic commentaries that were written in the centuries after the Prophet Muhammad. In fact, Muhammad himself had a lot to say about the jinn. So the jinn play a role along with angels in the creation stories presented in the Quran, the way angels and demons are part of our creation story in the Bible. We don't have the jinn in our story, however. They are an entirely separate race. Now, the story is told in the Quran that in the beginning there were angels and jinn. The angels were created from a very pure spiritual light, and the jinn were created from smokeless fire. So they had no original concrete form, which probably enabled them to be such superior shapeshifters. But the jinn's place was paradise. And they had access to heaven among the angels, but the two were separate. Well, then God decided to create human beings, and that's what caused the problem. Human beings were created out of earth and water, or clay. And not everybody in creation was happy with this new entity, human beings. And in fact, there are stories told in Judaic demonology and angelology as well, that everything was not well in heaven when human beings came around. Well, God instructed the angels to bow down before his new creation, Adam, and the angels complied because they follow God's will. But the jinn, that was a different story. Jinn, who had access in heaven, refused. And it was their leader, Iblis, whose name means despair, or he who is despaired, said, no, we're not going to bow down. I will not bow down. My kind will not bow down, because human beings are inferior. And I am not going to bow to something who is inferior to me. Well, this made God angry, and so he cursed the jinn and cast them out. They are not fallen angels, but they, in effect, fall from paradise because they are pushed out. Iblis goes to God and says, wait a minute, give us a chance here for redemption. We would like to prove to you that we're right, that human beings are unworthy of this status. They truly are inferior. So God says, okay, you have until Judgment Day to make your case, but go. You are out of paradise. So in modern terms then, we can consider this as the jinn get pushed into a parallel dimension. They are out of this world, but not completely out of the multi-dimensional space that we exist in. They have the presence right next door to us, around a bend in space and time, so to speak. We normally don't see them like we normally don't see angels all the time either, but yet under certain circumstances, they can be there. And believe me, they are finding portals and doorways and ways into our world, because a lot of them would like to come back. That seems to be the scenario played out over and over again. Now, what happens with Iblis is that he eventually becomes equated with Satan as the architect of evil, and his followers dedicate themselves to tormenting human beings, much the way we view demons today. But do remember, the jinn are not demons. They may act in demonic ways, some of them, but they are not demons. Now, there are other jinn who exist in their new dimension who are not ill-inclined toward human beings. They may even look kindly on us, or may not want anything to do with us whatsoever. But we are having interactions today with the hostile ones, the ones who want to make trouble for us. Now, in very ancient lore that even precedes the Quran, the jinn were the rulers of the wastelands. Because they are the hidden ones, and they do not like to have traffic with human beings unless it serves their purpose, they prefer remote and lonely areas. In the Middle East, that's caves. They like caves, they like desert areas. They are often associated with ruined places as well. I have found in my research around America that we have many geographical contours and places that, while not the equivalent of Middle Eastern desert areas, do provide, nonetheless, the isolation and the terrain very suitable to these entities. And I think a lot of them are in the Appalachians. A lot of them are in Pennsylvania, in mining areas. There's a lot of honeycombed underground areas that seem to be very active paranormally with a certain kind of entity that fits the jinn profile. This is the Majlis al-Jinn in Oman. It's a very large cave, and the name means the meeting place of the jinn. It's rumored to be one of the major places where the jinn like to congregate, and it's very inaccessible you can't just go and visit the cave. But it's quite spectacular inside because it is so large. Now here we are back at the Clash of the Titans. very good portrayal of these, the powers embodied in these entities. That they can be very large, they can be very small. You can bargain with them, you can make pacts with them, you can do deals, but you have to be very careful about how you do it, because if they can find a way to turn it back on you, they certainly will. And they command the forces of nature. Here in the film they're shown commanding the giant scorpions. But this lore about the jinn and their ability to manipulate the forces of nature is found throughout the world. And these are characteristics that I have found in these jinn-haunted cases. So in modern terms then, we can look at it as the jinn exist in another dimension, but they really want to be back in paradise. There are some of them who want to be back in paradise. That's our place. That's our world. And yet we are separated by dimensional boundaries. It's a barrier. And there are some of them who press up against that barrier, and we press back in various ways, because this is our space. We know that we can have experiences with different kinds of entities, but we don't necessarily want a lot of them moving in and becoming, next door neighbors all the time. But yet there seem to be entities who want to intrude on our space as often as they can. Now, the jinn have also entered our culture through fiction, through romance stories. They're exotic entities with very alluring powers. They're very popular in paranormal romance. Here's a novel called The Third Wish. Hunky jinn in the background. Let's hope the wish was really a good one and it worked out. Evidently it does. She looks very satisfied. But they're like vampires and the jinn are the new darlings in paranormal romance. But did you know that actually in folklore and tradition, you can even marry a jinn? There's a tradition called the Kareen. And it's very similar to being born with a guardian angel. We find this concept among the ancient Greeks and Romans who said you were born with a daemon, a good guy and a bad guy, who whispered in either side of your ear and either incited you to acts of good or tempted you to, fall off the wagon, so to speak. And so there are traditions in folklore, Middle Eastern folklore, that everyone is born with a companion jinn called the Kareen. And if you want to, you could even marry your Kareen. You may have a mortal spouse and a jinn spouse, but you have to be very careful that the jinn spouse is never jealous, because then poltergeist things and all sorts of bad luck and trouble will erupt in your household. So this jinn spouse can sort of remain hidden in the background, and there are rituals for this. It's formally and officially frowned upon, but nonetheless the practice does go on today, and is even written about in some of the contemporary anthropological literature. This is a poster from Egypt about a jinn marriage, talking about having a beast of a husband here. But the story is a very common one in the popular fiction and literature. We're more familiar with constant reinterpretations of the Arabian Nights, like Aladdin and his magic lamp. Cartoons like this, and I love Disney's work, but when we see things like this with these goofy blue things that it takes a lot of the mystique away from the actual supernatural entity. These are real entities. They're not silly little things in cartoons, and yet we've trivialized them in our media portrayal of them. The media tend to treat the genie, and it's always a genie usually, not a jinn, as something that's kind of goofy, quirky, oddball, offbeat, weird sense of humor. And so people tend to pass it off as total fantasy. They'll believe in, I've talked to people, and they'll believe in angels, fairies, ETs, Bigfoot, whatever else is out there, but the jinn, no. That's Aladdin and his lamp. It's Robin Williams territory.